Hey guys, welcome back to another Atlas Archives journey, where tonight we're venturing into the amber-laden forests of Lithuania, a small Baltic nation with a surprisingly outsized historical footprint. Picture this: a country smaller than most US states that once stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, making it medieval Europe's largest empire. Because apparently when Lithuanians decide to expand, they really don't mess around. From the ancient pagan groves where Lithuanian tribes first settled, to the gleaming EU headquarters where modern Lithuania helps shape European policy, this is a story of remarkable persistence. We'll explore how a nation of barely 3 million people managed to survive the Teutonic Knights, outlast the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, endure Tsarist repression, fight off 3 different armies simultaneously, survive both Nazi and Soviet occupations, and emerge as one of Europe's most successful post-communist democracies. It's like the ultimate historical survival guide, written in Lithuanian. Drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from tonight. Whether you're drifting off in Denver or wide awake in Warsaw, this community spans the globe, just like Lithuania's medieval empire once did. If you find yourself getting lost in these historical deep dives, hit that subscribe button and join the thousands of fellow history enthusiasts who've made the Atlas Archives their go-to bedtime companion. Trust me, your algorithm will thank you, and you'll never run out of fascinating places to explore. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey through the amber forests and ancient castles of Lithuania. Chapter 1: Introduction and Ancient Origins. Picture, if you will, a land carved by ice and time, nestled on the southeastern shores of the Baltic Sea like a well-kept secret between larger, more boisterous neighbours. Lithuania spans 65,300 square kilometres, making it larger than Belgium or Denmark, though considerably smaller than Texas, in case you were wondering about your next vacation options. The country stretches from 53 degrees and 53 minutes to 56 degrees and 27 minutes north latitude, which puts it roughly at the same level as Denmark and Scotland. So if you've ever wondered what it feels like to live at the latitude where Vikings once roamed, well, now you know. The Lithuania we see today is a masterpiece of glacial architecture, sculpted by ice sheets that retreated some 25,000 years ago, leaving behind a landscape that seems almost designed for contemplation. The highest point in the country reaches a dizzying 294 metres above sea level at Aukštojas Hill, which, in American terms, is about as tall as a 90-storey building lying on its side. This isn't exactly Mount Everest material, but then again, Lithuanians have always been more interested in expanding horizontally than vertically, as we'll soon discover. The terrain unfolds like a gentle poem written by glaciers, alternating between moderate lowlands and subtle highlands, punctuated by nearly 3,000 lakes larger than 1 hectare each. The eastern regions are particularly blessed with these watery gems, creating a landscape that early inhabitants must have thought was personally gift-wrapped by whatever deities controlled real estate. The country is ribboned with 758 rivers longer than 10 kilometres, led by the mighty Nemunas River, which stretches for 917 kilometres total, though only 600 kilometres of Lithuanian waterways are actually navigable. Medieval merchants were apparently quite particular about their water depth requirements. Dense forests once covered nearly the entire territory, and even today, about 33% of Lithuania remains wooded. These are mixed forests where pine, spruce and birch trees create a natural parliament, discussing the weather in whispers, while oak trees serve as the distinguished elder statesmen. The vegetation represents a fascinating mixture of coniferous and broadleaf woodlands, Arctic species, and steppe plants. Basically, Lithuania is where different botanical worlds come together for a very civilized continental congress. The climate here is transitional between maritime and continental, which is a meteorologist's way of saying unpredictable but generally pleasant. The Baltic Sea influences the coastal regions, while the interior experiences more continental weather patterns. January averages hover around -5 degrees Celsius, while July typically sees a comfortable 17 degrees Celsius. Annual rainfall varies from 500 millimeters inland to 850 millimeters near the coast, because apparently even Lithuanian precipitation believes in regional diversity. Now, let's travel back to a time when this landscape was home to some of Europe's most enduring peoples. The first human inhabitants arrived around 10,000 years ago, following the retreat of the last Ice Age glaciers. These were the Kunda, Niemen, and Narva cultures, essentially travelling hunters who probably took one look at all those forests and lakes and thought, you know what, this place has potential. By the 8th millennium before our Common Era, the climate had warmed sufficiently for forests to develop properly, and the inhabitants began settling into a more sedentary lifestyle, focused on local hunting, gathering, and freshwater fishing. They were essentially the world's first practitioners of slow living, though they probably didn't have Pinterest boards about it. The truly significant chapter begins with the arrival of the Indo-Europeans in the 3rd to 2nd millennium before our Common Era. These newcomers mixed with the local population and formed what would become known as the Baltic tribes, a collection of peoples who would prove to have staying power that would make even the most persistent door-to-door salesman jealous. The Balts, as they came to be known, occupied a vast territory stretching from what is now central Russia to the mouth of the Vistula River in Poland. They were essentially the original neighbours from heaven. They maintained trade relationships with distant lands, as evidenced by bronze, iron, silver, and glass artifacts found in their hill fortifications and graves. By 1000 before our Common Era, they had developed an advanced culture with contacts spanning both Eastern and Western Europe. The Baltic peoples were particularly famous for one product that today might seem rather mundane, but was essentially prehistoric gold: amber. This fossilized tree resin, found abundantly along Baltic shores, became the foundation of trade routes that stretched all the way to Rome. Roman coins and artifacts in Baltic archaeological sites prove that ancient Lithuanians were early pioneers in international commerce. The Amber Road became one of Europe's most important trade arteries, and Baltic amber has been found in Egyptian tombs and Roman palaces. Not bad for tree sap, really. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 97 of our Common Era, described the Aesti people, inhabitants of the southeastern Baltic shores who were probably Balts, in his study Germania. He noted their amber trade and their general character, though he was writing from the perspective of someone who considered anyone living beyond Roman borders to be inherently fascinating and slightly barbaric. Still, it's some of the earliest written recognition of Lithuanian ancestors in historical records. The various Baltic tribes each developed their own distinct characteristics and territories. The westernmost were the Prussians, who formed 10 principalities in what would later become East Prussia. They were described by Archbishop Adam of Bremen in 1075 as humane people who helped those in peril at sea, though he also called them stubborn pagans for their unwillingness to embrace Christianity. This ability to be simultaneously helpful and spiritually obstinate would become something of a Baltic trademark. South of the Prussians lived the Yotvingians and Galindians, inhabiting areas stretching from present-day Poland into Belarus. To their north, the ancestors of the Lithuanians, divided into the Samogitians in the lower regions of the Nemunas River and the Aukštaičiai in the upper regions, covered most of present-day Lithuania and stretched into Belarus. The Samogitians were called lowlanders, while the Aukštaičiai were highlanders, though given Lithuania's generally modest elevation, these terms were relative. It's like being the tallest person at a gathering of hobbits. Further north, 5 more subdivisions would eventually form the basis for modern Latvians. The Curonians inhabited the peninsula of Courland, while the Livs settled in northern Latvia and northern Courland. All these tribes maintain their own burial customs, which archaeologists today use to map their territorial boundaries. The Samogitians were known for their skeletal burials, while Aukštaitia practiced cremation. Apparently, even ancient Lithuanians couldn't agree on the proper send-off procedures. The area that would become Lithuania was remarkably remote and unattractive to most outside influences, including traders, which accounts for the Baltic people's separate linguistic, cultural, and religious identity. They were like the ultimate social distancers, maintaining their traditions while the rest of Europe went through various cultural upheavals. This isolation allowed traditional Lithuanian pagan customs and mythology to preserve many archaic elements that were lost elsewhere in Europe. Lithuanian, the language that emerged from this Baltic family, belongs to the Indo-European linguistic group, but forms its own distinct branch alongside Latvian. It's considered one of the most archaic Indo-European languages, retaining features that provide linguists with invaluable insights into the Proto-Indo-European past. Essentially, if languages were wines, Lithuanian would be that incredibly rare vintage that somehow survived in a forgotten cellar while everything else got consumed or corrupted over time. During the first millennium of the Common Era, the Baltic tribes lived in what might charitably be called splendid isolation. They were largely ignored by the great empires and migrations that swept across Europe, which allowed them to develop their own distinct culture without significant external interference. They traded amber for goods they couldn't produce locally, but otherwise maintained their traditional way of life with remarkable consistency. The tribes were organized under powerful chieftains, and by the time feudalism began making its way across Europe, they had developed a system of landlords and territorial control that was sophisticated enough to maintain order, but flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. Their warfare was primarily defensive, aimed at protecting their territories from Scandinavian Viking raids and expansion from various Slavic peoples to the east. The Curonians bore the heaviest burden of resistance against Swedish and Danish expansion, as they controlled much of the amber trade and used river routes that made them particularly vulnerable to Viking attacks. Icelandic and Norwegian sagas from later centuries speak of conflicts with eastern Baltic peoples, though the Balts proved remarkably effective at defending their homeland. They developed strong cavalry forces and defensive strategies that would serve them well in the challenges to come. As the first millennium drew to a close, external pressures began to mount. Slavic expansion from the east was gradually eroding the Baltic territories, while Christian kingdoms to the south and west began eyeing the Baltic regions with increasing interest. The Balts found themselves in the position of being Europe's last major pagan population, which in medieval times was roughly equivalent to having a giant target painted on their collective forehead. The first written mention of Lithuania appears in 1009 in the Annals of Quedlinburg, where a story describes Saint Bruno being killed by pagans on the border of Lithuania and Rus. This rather violent introduction to recorded history was unfortunately prophetic of the conflicts to come. By this time, the Lithuanian tribes had become powerful enough that their name was known to outsiders, though they probably would have preferred a more peaceful debut on the historical stage. The late 10th and early 11th centuries saw increasing pressure from the Golden Horde raids and Christian crusading efforts. The Kievan Rus had been largely debilitated by Mongol invasions between 1237 and 1240, creating a power vacuum that would prove crucial to Lithuanian development. But these dramatic changes were still in the future. As we leave this first chapter of Lithuanian history, we find a collection of Baltic tribes who had spent millennia developing a sophisticated culture in their forest-covered, lake-dotted homeland. They had maintained their independence through geography, determination, and a healthy dose of what might be called strategic stubbornness. They spoke one of Europe's most ancient languages, practiced traditional pagan religions that preserved Indo-European elements lost elsewhere, and had established themselves as essential players in the amber trade that connected northern and southern Europe. Little did they know that the challenges of the next century would force them to transform from a collection of independent tribes into one of medieval Europe's most powerful states. But that transformation, involving political consolidation, religious conflict, and territorial expansion that would make even the most ambitious medieval king envious, is a story for our next section. For now, rest easy knowing that in the forests and by the lakes of ancient Lithuania, a people were preserving something precious and enduring while the rest of Europe churned through empires and upheavals. Sometimes the most important historical developments happen not in the grand capitals and battlefields, but in the quiet places where traditions take root and languages preserve the echoes of humanity's deepest past. Chapter 2: The Grand Duchy Era. We return to a land poised on transformation, where whispered prayers of forest spirits would mingle with clashing swords and royal ambitions. The scattered Baltic tribes were about to discover that survival requires political genius capable of turning quarrelling cousins into one of Europe's most formidable empires. Remarkably, they would do this while maintaining pagan traditions longer than any other European nation, because Lithuanians have always been committed to doing things their own way, regardless of how many crusading knights suggested otherwise. The story of Lithuania's unification begins with Mindaugas, who emerged as the leader among Lithuanian tribal chiefs by the 1230s. In 1249, an internal war erupted between Mindaugas and his nephews Tautvilas and Edividas, the kind of family dispute that makes modern holiday dinners seem positively serene. Mindaugas proved the superior diplomat, convincing the Livonian order to provide military assistance in exchange for his conversion to Catholicism and some strategic real estate in western Lithuania. The timing was crucial. The Teutonic Knights had been systematically conquering Baltic territories under the banner of Christian conversion, eyeing Lithuanian lands with the enthusiasm of medieval real estate developers backed by divine mandate. Mindaugas faced a simple choice: unite the Lithuanian tribes or watch them be conquered piecemeal by crusading knights who were remarkably efficient at both prayer and warfare. In 1251, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull proclaiming the creation of the Kingdom of Lithuania, and on July 6, 1253, Mindaugas was crowned King of Lithuania by a papal legate. This date is now celebrated as Statehood Day in modern Lithuania, though the exact location of the coronation remains one of those historical mysteries that keep archaeologists employed and doctoral students caffeinated. The Pope's support for Mindaugas was motivated by the hope that a new Christian state could serve as a buffer against the Golden Horde, demonstrating that even in the 13th century, geopolitics was largely about creating strategic buffers between yourself and whoever happened to be pillaging the neighbourhood. Mindaugas's reign marked the beginning of Lithuanian statehood, but calling it stable would be generous. The new king found himself managing not only traditional tribal rivalries but also the expectations of his new Christian allies and the suspicions of his pagan subjects. Lithuania during this period was still fundamentally a collection of tribes held together by the personal authority of their leader, with power structures based more on kinship and military prowess than formal institutions. Think of it as medieval management by walking around, except the walking involved a lot of sword work. The challenge of maintaining this unity became evident in 1259 and 1260, when the Teutonic Knights suffered defeats at the Battle of Skjordas and the Battle of Derbe. These victories encouraged conquered Semigallians and Old Prussians to rebel against the Knights, creating opportunities for Lithuanian expansion. However, success in battle came with its own complications. Mindaugus's nephew Treniota, who had emerged as a successful military commander, began to advocate for a more aggressive anti-Christian policy, viewing the temporary alliance with the Livonian order as a betrayal of Lithuanian traditions. By 1261, Mindaugus had broken his peace with the Livonian order and, according to German sources, renounced Christianity entirely. This decision reflected the complex religious and political pressures of ruling a pagan people while maintaining diplomatic relations with Christian kingdoms. The challenge was roughly equivalent to trying to run a modern business while keeping both your traditional customer base and a completely different market segment happy, except with significantly more potential for actual warfare. The kingdom's brief experiment in official Christianity ended dramatically in 1263, with Mindaugus's assassination, orchestrated by Treniota and other nobles who opposed the Christian alliance. Two of Mindaugus's sons were also killed, effectively ending the royal line and plunging Lithuania back into the kind of succession crisis that medieval chroniclers loved to write about. The country reverted to paganism and its status as a kingdom was lost, though the basic state structure that Mindaugus had established survived and would prove to be remarkably durable. Following Mindaugus's death, Lithuania entered a period of instability with 7 different Grand Dukes over 32 years. The most significant was Traidenis 1270 to 1282, who established formal administrative systems and continued eastward expansion. The real transformation began with Gediminas 1316 to 1341, who expanded Lithuanian territory dramatically, absorbing large portions of present-day Belarus, western Ukraine, and parts of Russia. Gediminas established Vilnius as his capital and transformed it into a major trading centre linking Europe with the Baltic. His expansion strategy was conquest through competent administration. Rather than imposing Lithuanian rule, the Grand Duchy offered local princes the opportunity to maintain their positions within a larger, more stable structure. Orthodox Christian princes could continue governing their territories while benefiting from military protection and trade opportunities. This pragmatic approach was enabled by Lithuania's continued paganism, which made it more religiously tolerant than most Christian kingdoms. Lithuanian rulers could allow both Catholic and Orthodox traditions to coexist, accidental multiculturalism backed by intentional military power. Gediminas also established relationships with Western European powers, inviting foreign merchants and craftsmen while maintaining Lithuania's independence and unique character. After Gediminas's death in 1341 or 1342, the Grand Duchy continued its expansion under his sons, who established a diarchy that would become a distinctive feature of Lithuanian governance. Algirdas, with his capital in Vilnius, assumed the title of Grand Duke and focused on eastern expansion and relations with Russian principalities. His brother Kęstutis, based at the island castle of Trakai, managed western affairs and the ongoing conflicts with the Teutonic Order. This division of responsibilities was not merely a family arrangement, but a strategic recognition that the Grand Duchy faced fundamentally different challenges on its eastern and western borders. The East offered opportunities for expansion into Orthodox territories that had been weakened by Mongol invasions, while the West required constant vigilance against the systematic expansion of the Teutonic Order. The diarchy allowed Lithuania to pursue both opportunities and defend against threats without requiring either ruler to become an expert in all aspects of medieval geopolitics. Under Algirdas, who ruled from 1345 to 1377, Lithuanian expansion reached unprecedented levels. He conquered vast East Slavic territories, extending Lithuanian control to include Kiev after the crucial Battle of Blue Waters in 1362. This victory over Mongol forces effectively ended Golden Horde control over much of Ukraine and established Lithuania as the dominant power in the region. By the time of Algirdas's death, the Grand Duchy controlled territory from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, making it the largest state in Europe. The success of Lithuanian expansion during this period was due partly to the power vacuum created by Mongol invasions, but also to the administrative skills of Lithuanian rulers and their ability to offer local populations something better than either Mongol domination or the uncertainty of independence. The Grand Duchy provided military protection, maintained trade routes, and generally left local customs and religions undisturbed. For medieval people living in a world where political stability was rare and valuable, this was an attractive package. Meanwhile, Kęstutis spent his reign defending Lithuanian core territories against approximately 100 Teutonic Order attacks between 1340 and 1377. The conflict with the Order had become a defining feature of Lithuanian identity, inspiring legendary acts of heroism such as the defense of Trakai Castle, where Lithuanian defenders chose death rather than surrender. These stories became part of Lithuanian cultural memory, later inspiring literature, operas, and a sense of national identity based on resistance to foreign domination. The death of Algirdas in 1377 set the stage for the most momentous period in Lithuanian history. Algirdas left his throne to his eldest son Jogaila, but relations between the new Grand Duke and his uncle Kęstutis quickly deteriorated. In 1381, Kęstutis drove Jogaila from Vilnius and assumed power himself, but the following year saw Jogaila regain control and capture both Kęstutis and his son Vytautas. Kęstutis was murdered in prison, but Vytautas escaped and found refuge among the Teutonic Knights, setting up a complex political situation that would reshape European history. The resolution of this family conflict came through one of the most significant diplomatic marriages in European history. In 1385, Jogaila agreed to marry Jadwiga, the young Queen of Poland, converting to Catholicism and accepting the Polish crown as Władysław II Jagiełło. The Union of Krio, as this agreement became known, created a personal union between Lithuania and Poland that would last for centuries and transform both kingdoms into a major European power. The decision to ally with Poland rather than Moscow was crucial for Lithuanian development. Moscow had also negotiated with Jogaila between 1383 and 1384, but the Grand Duchy of Moscow was too distant to provide effective assistance against the Teutonic Knights, and presented its own complications as a competitor for the loyalty of Orthodox Lithuanian subjects. Poland, by contrast, offered immediate military assistance against the Order while allowing Lithuania to maintain its internal autonomy. Jogaila's conversion and marriage were followed by the official Christianization of Lithuania in 1387. The king returned from Poland and participated in mass conversion ceremonies throughout the summer, establishing a bishopric in Vilnius and making extraordinarily generous land grants to the church. This instantly made the Lithuanian church one of the most powerful institutions in the country, a development that would have long-term implications for Lithuanian culture and politics. However, the most dramatic consequence of the Polish-Lithuanian Union was yet to come. The Teutonic Order refused to recognize Lithuanian conversion as genuine and continued its attacks, forcing the Allied kingdoms to mount a decisive military campaign. The result was the Battle of Grunwald on July 15, 1410, one of medieval Europe's largest battles. Jogaila commanded Polish forces while Vytautas led Lithuanians, Tatars, Ruthenians, and even some pagan Samogitians. Lithuanian light cavalry initially appeared to flee when charged by Teutonic knights, but this planned withdrawal drew the knights into overextension. When Lithuanian forces returned, they struck from behind while Polish forces maintained frontal pressure. The Grand Master died from a lance through the throat, and most Teutonic forces were killed or captured. Grunwald permanently ended the Teutonic threat and established Poland-Lithuania as a major European power. The Peace of Thorn, 1411, forced the order to pay reparations and return Samogitia. Lithuania reached its zenith under Vytautas the Great, 1392 to 1430, expanding from Baltic to Black Sea and governing through multilingual administration using Lithuanian, Latin, German, and Chancery Ruthenian. Vytautas also demonstrated remarkable cultural sophistication, establishing schools supporting the writing of chronicles and opening Lithuania to broader European intellectual influences. He invited various ethnic groups to settle in Lithuanian territories, including Karaim and Tatar families who served as translators, farmers, traders, and diplomats. These communities maintained their distinct identities while contributing to the Grand Duchy's cosmopolitan character, an early example of successful multiculturalism in medieval Europe. The period of Vytautas' rule represented the peak of Lithuanian medieval achievement. The Grand Duchy had successfully defended its independence against crusading orders, expanded to become Europe's largest state, developed sophisticated administrative systems, and created a unique political culture that balanced Lithuanian traditions with the practical requirements of governing a multi-ethnic empire. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful political experiments of the medieval period. However, this golden age also contained the seeds of future challenges. The Lithuanian nobility had begun adopting Polish cultural practices and the Catholic faith, creating potential tensions with Orthodox subjects and traditional Lithuanian customs. The Grand Duchy's vast territories made communication and central control increasingly difficult, while the growing power of Moscow presented a long-term threat to Lithuanian eastern possessions. Vytautas died in 1430 while preparing for his coronation as King of Lithuania, a ceremony that would have formalized Lithuanian independence from Polish oversight. His death marked the end of Lithuania's period of maximum expansion and the beginning of a new phase in which the Grand Duchy would need to balance its partnership with Poland against its desire for independent development. As we conclude this chapter, we find a nation that transformed from pagan Baltic tribes into Europe's largest medieval state while maintaining traditional characteristics. The Grand Duchy proved that successful empire building required not just military strength but administrative competence, cultural flexibility, and diplomatic skill. Being Europe's last pagans wasn't a disadvantage. Sometimes religious neutrality is a valuable diplomatic asset. The Lithuania emerging from this period was no longer simply a Baltic tribal confederation, but a major European power spanning Baltic to Black Sea, with sophisticated administration and unique cultural identity blending Lithuanian, Slavic, and Polish influences. Foundations were laid for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but that story, with its own triumphs and challenges, awaits our next exploration, where kings spoke multiple languages and empires were built on letting diverse peoples remain diverse. Chapter 3: Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The amber forests have witnessed many transformations, but few as profound as the one we explore tonight. We journey now into an era when Lithuania's destiny became intertwined with Poland's in one of history's most fascinating political experiments, a time when the Grand Duchy evolved from an independent medieval power into a partner in what would become Europe's largest early modern state. This is the story of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a period that would see both the pinnacle of Lithuanian cultural achievement and the seeds of its eventual subjugation. Because sometimes the most successful partnerships are also the most complicated, especially when one partner gradually forgets that it was supposed to remain an equal. The transformation from personal union to full political integration began in earnest during the 1560s, driven by external pressures that made closer cooperation not just advantageous but essential for survival. The Grand Duchy faced mounting threats from an increasingly powerful Muscovy to the east, while both Lithuania and Poland struggled with the challenge of governing the vast Ukrainian territories that had become destabilized by Cossack uprisings and religious conflicts between Orthodox and Catholic populations. In January 1569, representatives from both nations met in the Polish town of Lublin to negotiate what would become one of the most significant political treaties in European history. The Sejm convened with high hopes but immediately encountered the fundamental disagreement that had complicated Polish-Lithuanian relations for decades. The Poles wanted full incorporation of the Grand Duchy into the Crown of Poland, while the Lithuanians insisted on a federal arrangement that would preserve their political autonomy and distinct institutions. The negotiations quickly reached an impasse, with neither side willing to compromise on their fundamental positions. In March, most of the Lithuanian delegation, led by Vilnius voivode Mikołaj, the Red Radziwill, walked out of the talks and returned home in frustration. This diplomatic crisis might have ended the union negotiations entirely, but Polish King Sigismund II Augustus had other ideas, and he was willing to use some rather heavy-handed negotiating tactics to achieve his goals. With the Lithuanians absent, the Polish side took advantage of their departure to simply declare the incorporation of several of Lithuania's most valuable territories into the Polish crown. On June 6th, the king announced the annexation of Podlakia, Volhynia, Brakwa, and the Kyiv voivodeships, territories that constituted more than half of modern Ukraine and represented a substantial portion of the Grand Duchy's land and population. It was essentially a medieval version of changing the rules while the other team was in the locker room. This unilateral action forced the Lithuanian nobles' hands. The annexed territories contained many Orthodox nobles who were actually eager to join the Polish sphere, seeing better economic and political opportunities there than in the increasingly Catholic-dominated Lithuanian administration. Faced with the loss of their most valuable lands and the defection of key supporters, the Lithuanian delegation returned to Lublin under the leadership of Jan Hieronymovich Chodkiewicz and resumed negotiations from a considerably weakened position. On July 1st, 1569, the Union of Lublin was finally signed, creating the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, officially known as the Commonwealth of Both Nations, or Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów. The agreement established a federal state that would be ruled by a jointly elected monarch carrying the titles of King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. The Commonwealth would have a common parliament, the Sejm, and coordinate foreign policy, while each nation theoretically retained its own laws, administration, and military forces. However, the reality was more complex than the formal agreement suggested. Poland emerged as the clearly dominant partner, with greater representation in the joint Sejm and control over the economically valuable Ukrainian territories that had been transferred from Lithuanian control. The Union guaranteed freedom of settlement and land ownership throughout the Commonwealth, which in practice meant that Polish nobles could acquire estates in Lithuania, while Polish language and culture began to spread among the Lithuanian nobility, who saw association with Polish customs as a mark of sophistication and political advancement. The immediate aftermath of the Union saw remarkable territorial expansion as the newly unified Commonwealth flexed its considerable military and political muscles. Polish and Lithuanian forces quickly conquered Livonia, the Baltic region that corresponds to much of modern Latvia and Estonia, bringing valuable trade routes and port cities under Commonwealth control. The German-ruled duchies of Kurland and Prussia became Polish-Lithuanian vassals, creating a network of client states that extended Commonwealth influence throughout the eastern Baltic region. The period from the Union of Lublin to the mid-1700s is widely regarded as the Golden Age of the Commonwealth, and by extension, of Lithuanian participation in European high culture. At its territorial peak in the early 1600s, the Commonwealth controlled approximately 1 million square kilometres, making it one of the largest states in Europe. The population reached around 12 million people, including roughly 4.5 million Poles, 3.5 million Ukrainians, 1.5 million Belarusians, 750,000 Lithuanians, and significant Jewish, German, and other minority populations. What made the Commonwealth remarkable wasn't just its size, but its political system, which was unprecedented in European history. The golden liberty enjoyed by the nobility created what historians describe as the world's first large-scale experiment in constitutional monarchy with democratic elements. Noble democracy, as it was known, extended political rights to approximately 10% of the male population, a proportion vastly higher than in any other European state of the period. The political system was based on the principle that the king reigned but did not govern, with real power resting in the hands of the noble assemblies. Each new monarch had to agree to the Pacta Conventa, specific pledges that limited royal power and guaranteed noble privileges. The system included unprecedented guarantees of religious tolerance, codified in the Warsaw Confederation of 1573, which made the Commonwealth a haven for religious minorities fleeing persecution elsewhere in Europe. The cultural flowering that accompanied this political experiment was particularly visible in Lithuania, where nobles enthusiastically embraced Renaissance and Baroque learning. Vilnius University, founded in 1579, became a leading Eastern European centre of learning. However, this Renaissance came at a significant cost: accelerated Polonization. Lithuanian nobles increasingly viewed Polish as the language of sophistication, while Lithuanian and Eastern Slavic languages were considered suitable only for peasants. The Counter-Reformation brought systematic Catholicization while the Grand Duchy maintained formal autonomy within the Commonwealth structure. Lithuania preserved its own legal code, the Third Lithuanian Statute of 1588, and distinct administrative traditions. Economically, integration into the grain trade through Gdańsk brought profits for landowners, but reinforced agricultural dependency and strengthened serfdom. The Commonwealth's military achievements included the famous Polish winged hussars, heavy cavalry with distinctive feathered wings and devastating lance charges, many featuring Lithuanian nobles. Joint forces achieved victories against Ottoman Turks, Swedish invasions, and Russian expansion, maintaining major European power status into the 1700s. However, the noble democracy that had been innovative became increasingly dysfunctional as the liberum veto, any noble's right to halt parliamentary proceedings, was used more frequently, often at foreign instigation. The first major crisis was the Deluge, beginning with Bohdan Khmelnytsky's Cossack uprising in 1648, followed by devastating Swedish and Russian invasions. For Lithuania specifically, the deluge was catastrophic. Russian forces occupied much of the Grand Duchy, while Swedish armies ravaged the western regions. Vilnius was captured and burned by Russian Cossacks in 1655, leading to what historians describe as the first sack of the city since the medieval Teutonic invasions. The population of Vilnius fell from approximately 30,000 to fewer than 6,000, while countless manor houses, churches and cultural monuments were destroyed. The demographic impact was staggering. Historians estimate that the Commonwealth lost approximately one-third of its population during the conflicts of 1648 to 1667, proportionally higher losses than those suffered during World War II. The economic disruption was equally severe, as trade networks collapsed, agricultural production plummeted, and the accumulation of cultural and material wealth built up over the previous century was largely wiped away. Although the Commonwealth eventually expelled the foreign invaders and restored its territorial integrity, it never fully recovered its former strength. The conflicts had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the political system that became increasingly difficult to address as noble factions grew more entrenched and foreign powers learned to exploit parliamentary paralysis for their own advantage. The late 17 and early 1800s saw a gradual transformation of the Commonwealth from a major European power into what historians describe as a noble democracy in decline. The liberum veto, originally used sparingly, became routine as any noble could halt government proceedings on virtually any pretext. Between 1696 and 1717, only one sagem in six actually completed its business, leaving the Commonwealth unable to raise taxes, maintain armies, or respond effectively to external threats. This political paralysis occurred at precisely the moment when the Commonwealth's neighbours, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, were consolidating centralized monarchies with professional armies and efficient tax systems. The contrast became increasingly stark as countries that had once been considered minor powers began to surpass the Commonwealth in military and economic strength. The cultural consequences of this decline were particularly significant for Lithuania. As the Commonwealth weakened, the centre of ethnic Lithuanian culture shifted to Lithuania Minor, the Lithuanian-speaking regions of East Prussia, where a significant literature in Lithuanian developed under German rule. Within the Commonwealth itself, the Polonization of the nobility was so complete that by the early 1800s, most Lithuanian nobles spoke Polish as their primary language and identified primarily with Polish rather than Lithuanian cultural traditions. The final attempts at reform came in the late 18th century with the Constitution of May 3, 1791, often called the world's second written national constitution after the American Constitution. This document attempted to transform the Commonwealth into a more centralized state with hereditary monarchy and reduced noble privileges, but it came too late and faced opposition from both conservative nobles and the neighbouring powers who preferred a weak Commonwealth. The partitions of Poland-Lithuania between 1772 and 1795 represented the final failure of the Commonwealth experiment. Russia, Prussia, and Austria systematically carved up Commonwealth territory in 3 stages, with each power justifying its actions as necessary to restore order to a state that had become incapable of governing itself. The last Commonwealth king, Stanisław Augustus Poniatowski, abdicated in 1795, formally ending nearly 4 centuries of Lithuanian independence. By the final partition, Lithuania proper was incorporated into the Russian Empire, beginning a period of foreign rule that would last, with only brief interruptions, until 1991, The Commonwealth period had transformed Lithuania from a medieval Grand Duchy into a participant in early modern European civilization, but it had also begun the process of cultural assimilation that would challenge Lithuanian national identity for centuries to come. As we conclude this chapter of Lithuanian history, we find a nation that had experienced both the heights of cultural achievement and the depths of political dissolution. The Commonwealth period had brought Lithuanian nobles into full participation in European high culture, created some of the continent's most impressive architectural and intellectual achievements, and demonstrated that religiously and ethnically diverse populations could coexist peacefully under appropriate political arrangements. However, the price of this achievement had been the gradual erosion of Lithuanian distinctiveness. The Grand Duchy that had once been Europe's last pagan stronghold had become thoroughly Catholic and largely Polonized. The political system that had once been admirably flexible had become paralyzed by its own democratic mechanisms. The cultural flowering that had made Vilnius a major European centre had been built on foundations that proved unable to withstand the pressures of a changing international system. The Commonwealth experiment offers both inspiration and cautionary lessons about the possibilities and limitations of voluntary political union between different nations. It demonstrated that such unions could achieve remarkable cultural and political achievements when conditions were favourable, but also showed how quickly these achievements could be lost when external pressures combined with internal weaknesses. Chapter 4. Under Foreign Rule. The amber forests have witnessed conquest and resistance, but few periods tested Lithuanian resilience more thoroughly than the century, and a quarter of Russian imperial rule that began in 1795. This is the story of a nation that refused to disappear, despite systematic efforts to erase its language, culture, and very identity from the map of Europe. It's a tale of forbidden books smuggled in the dark of night, secret schools held in forest clearings, and the extraordinary determination of a people who somehow managed to preserve their heritage while living under one of history's most determined imperial assimilators. Because apparently, when you tell Lithuanians they can't do something, they take it as a personal challenge. The transformation from Commonwealth partner to Imperial province began immediately after the Third Partition in 1795, though the Russian approach to governing Lithuania evolved considerably over the following decades. Initially, the change appeared relatively benign, more a matter of swapping one distant ruler for another rather than a fundamental restructuring of society. Many Lithuanian nobles retained their estates and positions, while the basic patterns of daily life continued much as they had under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, this apparent continuity masked a fundamental shift in political philosophy. Where the Commonwealth had been a federal structure that accommodated diverse traditions and languages, the Russian Empire operated on principles of centralization and uniformity. The Tsarist government viewed local customs, languages, and institutions not as valuable diversity to be preserved, but as obstacles to efficient administration and potential sources of disloyalty to imperial authority. The first major blow to Lithuanian autonomy came in 1832, following the November Uprising of 1830 to 1831. This Polish-led rebellion against Russian rule had found significant support among Lithuanian nobles, many of whom still identified closely with Polish culture and harboured hopes of restoring the Commonwealth. The uprising's failure provided Russian authorities with both justification and opportunity to implement more restrictive policies. The University of Vilnius, founded in 1579 and one of Eastern Europe's most prestigious institutions of higher learning, was closed by Tsar Nicholas I as collective punishment for the province's participation in the revolt. The closure eliminated not just an educational institution, but the intellectual centre that had sustained Lithuanian and Polish cultural life for centuries. It was roughly equivalent to closing Harvard, Yale, and Princeton simultaneously while declaring that the local population was too politically unreliable to deserve higher education. In 1840, the Lithuanian Legal Code, the third Lithuanian statute that had governed the Grand Duchy since 1588, was officially abolished and replaced with Russian imperial law. This seemingly technical administrative change eliminated one of the last formal connections to Lithuania's independent past and signalled that the region would henceforth be governed according to Russian rather than Lithuanian legal traditions. By 1842, even the name Lithuania was officially stricken from government records. The territory became known simply as the Northwestern Region, or Northwestern Krai, divided into the governorates of Vilnius, Kaunas, and Grodno. To Russian administrators, Lithuania was not a distinct historical entity with its own traditions, but merely a northwestern province of Russia that needed to be fully integrated into the imperial system. The most systematic and destructive phase of Russification began after the January uprising of 1863 to 1864. Mikhail Nikolaevich Muravyov, known as the Hangman, developed the program of restoration of Russian beginnings, based on the theory that Lithuanians were naturally Russians corrupted by Polish Catholic influence. The centrepiece was the Lithuanian press ban, 1864 to 1904, a 40-year prohibition on printing Lithuanian language materials in Latin alphabet. Books could only use Cyrillic letters, designed to facilitate linguistic assimilation. This created a bizarre literary underground, where Lithuanian books were published in Lithuania Minor, German-controlled East Prussia, and smuggled back by knygnešiai, book carriers who risked imprisonment to transport forbidden literature. Book carriers became folk heroes, developing elaborate techniques for concealing literature. Books hidden in specially constructed false bottoms of grain wagons, sewn into clothing, buried in predetermined locations along established routes, even concealed inside coffins during funeral processions. It was an entire underground economy based on the idea that books were worth risking your freedom for, a concept that might seem foreign to people who get frustrated when their ebooks take more than 3 seconds to download. Meanwhile, the educational system became another major battleground. Russian authorities mandated that all instruction be conducted in Russian, prohibited the use of Lithuanian even for casual conversation among students, and created an atmosphere of surveillance and intimidation in schools throughout the region. Teachers were required to report students who spoke Lithuanian, while students were encouraged to inform on their teachers and classmates for any sign of nationalist sentiment. This educational Russification was accompanied by efforts to transform Lithuania's religious landscape. The Russian Orthodox Church was promoted as the truly national religion of all Slavic peoples, while Roman Catholicism was portrayed as a foreign import. Dozens of Catholic churches were closed or transferred to Orthodox control. New Orthodox churches were constructed in prominent locations, and financial incentives were offered to encourage conversion from Catholicism to Orthodoxy. These systematic efforts produced an unexpected result. They strengthened Lithuanian national consciousness in ways that more tolerant policies had never achieved. Persecution created shared identity among people who might otherwise have continued thinking of themselves primarily in regional, religious, or class terms. The harshness of Russification policies forced Lithuanians to choose between ancestral culture and imperial opportunities. Many chose cultural loyalty over material advancement. The response included illegal schools, daraktorii, established in private homes, barns, and forest clearings, Taught by teachers who risked careers and freedom to provide instruction in the forbidden language, these secret schools played a crucial role in maintaining Lithuanian literacy during the press ban period. Teaching materials were necessarily limited and often handmade, with instructors relying on smuggled books, hand-copied texts, and oral tradition to convey both basic education and cultural knowledge to new generations. The period also saw emergence of modern Lithuanian literature and journalism, as writers and intellectuals responded to cultural suppression by creating works celebrating Lithuanian identity and history. The newspaper Aušra, Dawn, published in Lithuania Minor and smuggled into Russian-controlled territory, became a focal point for Lithuanian cultural revival. Its editors and contributors, including prominent figures like Jonas Basanavičius and Vinkas Kudirka, used historical research and literary creativity to argue that Lithuanians constituted a distinct nation with legitimate claims to cultural and political autonomy. The Lithuanian national revival faced unique challenges due to the region's complex ethnic landscape. Leaders strategically based national identity on ethnicity and language rather than historical territory, distinguishing Lithuanian from Polish nationalism while envisioning a more ethnically coherent nation-state. The movement gained momentum after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–05, and the Revolution of 1905 forced imperial concessions. The press ban was lifted in 1904, unleashing floods of Lithuanian publications. Lithuanian deputies in the Russian Duma advocated for autonomy and minority rights, providing valuable parliamentary experience for future independence leaders. World War I created conditions that finally made Lithuanian independence possible. The German invasion of 1915 ended Russian rule throughout most of Lithuania, though it subjected the population to military occupation and economic exploitation. German policies were initially driven by strategic considerations rather than sympathy for Lithuanian national aspirations, but the war's progression created opportunities for Lithuanian politicians to advance their cause. The German military administration, known as Oberost, treated Lithuania as occupied territory and initially resisted autonomous institutions to prioritize wartime logistics and post-war annexation plans. However, as the war dragged on and Germany's position weakened, German authorities became more receptive to local cooperation that might strengthen their hand in eventual peace negotiations. In September 1917, German authorities permitted the convening of the Vilnius Conference, a gathering of over 200 Lithuanian delegates who elected a 20-member Council of Lithuania and adopted resolutions calling for the restoration of Lithuanian independence. The Germans hoped this conference would demonstrate Lithuanian desire to separate from Russia and align with German interests. But the Lithuanian delegates had their own agenda that went far beyond what Germany intended to permit. The path from the Vilnius Conference to the Declaration of Independence was complex and fraught with diplomatic manoeuvring. The German Empire wanted Lithuanian cooperation in exchange for limited autonomy within a German-dominated Eastern European sphere of influence, while Lithuanian leaders sought genuine independence from all foreign control. The Council of Lithuania had to navigate carefully between German demands for alliance and the expectations of the Lithuanian people for true self-determination. Initially, the Council adopted a declaration on December 11, 1917, that proclaimed independence from Russia but included provisions for firm and permanent alliance with Germany. This compromise satisfied neither the Germans, who wanted even closer ties, nor many Lithuanians, who viewed any alliance as a betrayal of genuine independence aspirations. 4 council members resigned in protest, creating a political crisis that threatened to undermine the entire independence movement. After months of negotiations, heated debates, and political manoeuvring, the Council of Lithuania unanimously adopted the final Act of Independence on February 16, 1918. The document, signed by all 20 council members at 30 Duchy Street in Vilnius, a building now known as the House of the Signatories, proclaimed the restoration of the independent state of Lithuania, governed by democratic principles, with Vilnius as its capital, and declared the termination of all state ties which formerly bound this state to other nations. The act was carefully worded to avoid any mention of alliance with Germany while asserting Lithuania's right to complete independence from all foreign powers, including Russia, Germany and Poland. It represented a remarkable diplomatic achievement for a small nation caught between competing great powers, and it provided the legal foundation for modern Lithuanian statehood that would be invoked again when independence was restored in 1990. However, the immediate practical impact of the declaration was limited. German authorities initially prohibited publication of the act and continued to treat Lithuania as occupied territory. The text was distributed and printed illegally, much like the forbidden Lithuanian books of earlier decades. Real independence would have to wait until Germany's defeat in November 1918, followed by successful defense against Soviet attempts at reconquest during the Wars of Independence of 1918 to 1921. As we conclude this chapter of Lithuanian history, we find a nation that had survived one of the most systematic attempts at cultural elimination in European history. The Russian Empire's century-long effort to transform Lithuanians into Russians had not only failed but had actually strengthened Lithuanian national consciousness and provided the foundation for modern Lithuanian identity. The period of Russian rule demonstrated both the vulnerability and the resilience of small nations caught between great powers. Lithuania had lost its political independence and faced sustained pressure to abandon its cultural distinctiveness, yet it emerged from this ordeal with a clearer sense of national identity and a stronger commitment to self-determination than it had possessed at the beginning of the Imperial period. The methods developed to resist cultural suppression, underground education, literary smuggling, preservation of folk traditions, and the gradual construction of modern national consciousness would prove valuable during later periods of foreign occupation. The experience of maintaining cultural continuity under adverse conditions became part of Lithuanian national identity itself, contributing to the persistence and eventual success of independence movements in the 20th century. Chapter 5: Independence, War and Soviet Era. The Amber Forests have witnessed declarations and constitutions, but they were about to learn that proclaiming independence and actually achieving it are two very different things. We now enter perhaps the most tumultuous period in Lithuanian history, 7 decades of fighting for freedom, losing it, finding it again, losing it once more, and finally reclaiming it for good. This is the story of a nation that had to defend its newly declared independence in 3 simultaneous wars, enjoyed 2 decades of sovereign statehood, endured dual occupations by both Nazi and Soviet forces, and then spent half a century under communist rule before finally breaking free for the last time. Because apparently, when Lithuanians decide to become independent, they really commit to the process, even when it takes multiple attempts and several generations to get it right. The immediate aftermath of the February 16th declaration revealed Lithuania's precarious position. German defeat in November 1918 created a power vacuum that multiple forces rushed to fill. The first government, led by Augustinas Voldemaras, initially believed Lithuania could exist without significant military forces, an optimistic assessment that lasted until the first foreign army appeared. Reality arrived in December with the advancing Red Army. Lithuanian communist leader Vinkus Mykovičius Kapsukas proclaimed the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, nullifying the Independence Act and calling for integration into Soviet Russia. The first wars of independence began in January 1919 when Bolshevik forces occupied Vilnius and eastern Lithuania. The newly formed Lithuanian army, established November 23, 1918, faced defending a country that barely existed on paper. Early recruits were poorly equipped but possessed something opponents lacked. They were fighting for their own homes. Lithuanian forces, supported by remaining German troops acting on Allied instructions, gradually pushed the Red Army eastward. By August 1919, Lithuania had cleared most Bolshevik troops and signed a peace treaty with Soviet Russia on July 12, 1920, formally recognizing Lithuanian independence. A new threat emerged with the Bermontians, the West Russian volunteer army led by Pavel Bermont-Avalov. This mixed German-Russian force occupied significant portions of Samogitia, implementing Russian-only administration and systematic looting. Lithuanian forces achieved decisive victory on November 21st and 22nd near Radviliškis, capturing 30 airplanes and 10 cannons. By December 15th, all Bermontian forces were evacuated. The Third War was with Poland, whose leader Józef Pilsudski advocated for an intermarium federation resembling the old Commonwealth, while Lithuanian leaders insisted on complete independence. The conflict climaxed in October 1920, when Polish forces under General Żeligowski occupied Vilnius 2 days after signing the Suwałki peace agreement, creating the puppet state of central Lithuania. Lithuania lost 1/3 of its territory and its historical capital. Despite these territorial losses, Lithuania had achieved something remarkable: genuine independence defended successfully against 3 different military challenges. The wars had demonstrated that the Lithuanian national movement had evolved from cultural resistance to effective statecraft, capable of building institutions, conducting diplomacy, and organizing military defense under extremely challenging conditions. The human cost was significant. Over 1,700 Lithuanian volunteers died in the conflicts, but Lithuania emerged as a recognized member of the international community. The interwar period, 1921 to 1940, represented Lithuania's first experience with modern democratic governance. The Constituent Assembly adopted a democratic constitution in 1922, and Lithuania joined the League of Nations. However, economic challenges and regional instability created pressures the young democratic system struggled to manage. On December 17, 1926, a military coup organized by the Lithuanian Nationalist Union overthrew the elected government and installed Antanas Smetona as president. Smetona's authoritarian regime, 1926 to 1940, dissolved opposition parties, restricted press freedom, and ruled by decree. Despite its authoritarian character, the regime achieved significant economic and cultural development, promoted Lithuanian language and literature, and maintained tolerant policies toward Lithuania's Jewish population. The greatest challenge was navigating the dangerous international situation, culminating in the 1939 German ultimatum, forcing Lithuania to cede the Klaipėda region. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23, 1939, sealed Lithuania's fate by dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Initially assigned to the German sphere, Lithuania was transferred to Soviet control through a subsequent agreement in September 1939. This decision was made without any consultation with Lithuanian authorities and reflected the great power politics that small nations had no ability to influence or resist. Following the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, the USSR forced Finland and the Baltic states to sign mutual assistance treaties that permitted Soviet military bases on their territories. Lithuania's treaty, signed on October 10, 1939, allowed 18,000 Soviet soldiers to be stationed in Lithuania in exchange for the return of Vilnius, which Soviet forces had captured from the retreating Polish army. Many Lithuanians initially welcomed this development, seeing the return of their historical capital as compensation for the loss of independence that the Soviet military presence clearly implied. The final act came on June 14, 1940, when Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov delivered an ultimatum to Lithuania, accusing the government of violating the Mutual Assistance Treaty and demanding regime change, punishment of specified officials, and unlimited access for additional Red Army troops. The ultimatum allowed less than 12 hours for a response and made clear that Soviet forces would invade regardless of the Lithuanian government's answer. President Smetona initially argued for military resistance, even if purely symbolic, but the majority of the government chose to accept the Soviet demands rather than risk massive bloodshed in a hopeless military confrontation. Smetona left the country in protest, crossing into Germany on foot after Lithuanian border guards initially refused to let him pass. His departure worked to Soviet advantage by allowing them to portray him as abandoning his people in their hour of need. The Soviet occupation proceeded according to a carefully planned script designed to create the appearance of voluntary incorporation into the USSR. A puppet government was installed under Justus Paleckis. Rigged elections were held in July 1940 with the Union of Labour Lithuania winning 99% of the vote, and the new parliament dutifully voted to request admission to the Soviet Union. On August 3, 1940, the Supreme Soviet formally accepted Lithuania as the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, completing the legal fiction of voluntary annexation. The first year of Soviet rule brought systematic efforts to reshape Lithuanian society according to communist principles. Private property was nationalized, agricultural collectivization was initiated, and political parties except the Communist Party were banned. Thousands of Lithuanians deemed politically unreliable were arrested and deported to Siberian labor camps. The policies created widespread discontent, but organized resistance was difficult under the surveillance and control systems that Soviet authorities quickly established. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, initially appeared to offer hope for restoration of Lithuanian independence. Many Lithuanians viewed the German army as liberators from Soviet oppression, and a provisional government led by the Lithuanian Activist Front was proclaimed on June 23, 1941. However, German policies quickly demonstrated that Nazi occupation would be no improvement over Soviet rule, and in many respects would prove far worse. German administrators established the Ostland province that included all three Baltic states and Belarus, making clear that they had no intention of recognizing Baltic independence. The provisional Lithuanian government was disbanded after refusing to serve as an administrative agent for German occupation. More devastating still was the implementation of Nazi racial policies that resulted in the virtual elimination of Lithuania's Jewish population, which had constituted approximately 7% of the country's inhabitants and played crucial roles in urban economic and intellectual life. The Holocaust in Lithuania was particularly swift and thorough, with local collaborators participating in mass killings that eliminated approximately 95% of Lithuanian Jews within months of the German invasion. This catastrophe eliminated not only individual lives, but entire communities that had been integral to Lithuanian society for centuries, leaving wounds that would influence Lithuanian development long after the war ended. The return of Soviet forces in 1944 began the longest period of foreign rule in Lithuanian history. The second Soviet occupation was characterized by much more systematic efforts to transform Lithuanian society than had been possible during the brief first occupation. Massive deportations removed perceived opponents of Soviet rule. Approximately 200,000 Lithuanians were deported to Siberia between 1944 and 1953. Collectivization destroyed traditional agricultural patterns, while industrialization and urbanization reshaped the physical and social landscape of the country. However, Soviet rule also faced sustained resistance from Lithuanian partisans known as Forest Brothers, who conducted an armed insurgency that lasted from 1944 to the early 1950s. This guerrilla war involved up to 40,000 fighters at its peak and demonstrated that Soviet control, while militarily dominant, lacked popular legitimacy. The partisans were gradually worn down by superior Soviet resources and the establishment of more effective control systems, but their resistance became a crucial element of Lithuanian national memory. The post-Stalin period brought relative liberalization under Lithuanian Communist Party leader Antanas Sniečkus, whose long tenure from 1936 to 1974 provided stability and allowed gradual cultural revival within the constraints of Soviet ideology. Economic development transformed Lithuania from a predominantly agricultural society to an industrialized Soviet republic, with relatively high living standards, though this came at the cost of massive Russian immigration and continued political restrictions. The final chapter of Soviet rule began with Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the 1980s, which created space for expression of long-suppressed national aspirations. The Lithuanian independence movement Soothes, founded in 1988, initially focused on cultural and environmental issues, but quickly evolved into a political organization demanding restoration of independence. The dramatic Baltic Way demonstration of August 23, 1989, a human chain linking Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn involving 2 million participants, demonstrated the depth of Baltic desire for freedom and captured international attention. On March 11, 1990, the newly elected Supreme Council, led by Vytautas Landsbergis, adopted the Act of the Re-establishment of the State of Lithuania, declaring that the Act of Independence of February 16, 1918 of the Council of Lithuania and the Constituent Assembly Decree of May 15, 1920, on the re-established democratic state of Lithuania never lost their legal effect and comprised the constitutional foundation of the state of Lithuania. This declaration initiated a tense confrontation with Moscow that culminated in the tragic events of January 13, 1991, when Soviet forces attacked the Vilnius television tower and other strategic buildings, killing 14 unarmed civilians. However, the failed August coup in Moscow and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union finally secured Lithuanian independence, which was recognized internationally in September 1991. As we conclude this chapter, we find Lithuania emerging from 7 decades of struggle between independence and occupation, democracy and authoritarianism, national identity and imperial domination. The Lithuanian people had demonstrated remarkable persistence in maintaining their cultural distinctiveness and political aspirations, despite repeated attempts at forced integration into larger imperial systems. The restoration of independence in 1991 represented not the creation of a new state, but the resumption of a national project that had been interrupted but never abandoned. The Amber Forests had witnessed the full cycle of modern Lithuanian history, from the declaration of independence through defensive wars, democratic experimentation, authoritarian rule, foreign occupations, resistance movements, and finally successful restoration of sovereignty. The nation that emerged in 1991 was profoundly shaped by these experiences, carrying forward both the achievements and the traumas of its complex 20th century journey toward freedom. Rest peacefully, fellow travellers. The longest night in Lithuanian history was finally ending, and the dawn of restored independence was about to illuminate new possibilities for this resilient nation by the Baltic Sea. Chapter 6: Modern Lithuania. The amber forests had witnessed declarations of independence before, but September 17, 1991 marked something different: international recognition that would actually stick. As Lithuanian flags flew from government buildings without fear of being torn down by foreign soldiers, the small nation by the Baltic Sea faced a new challenge, transforming from a Soviet republic into a modern European democracy. This final chapter chronicles Lithuania's remarkable journey, from the wreckage of communist rule to becoming a prosperous member of both NATO and the European Union, proving that small nations with big dreams and persistent effort can indeed shape their own destinies. The immediate aftermath of restored independence presented Lithuania with challenges that would have daunted larger nations. The Soviet economic system had collapsed, leaving behind inefficient state enterprises, obsolete infrastructure, and a population with no experience of market economics or democratic governance. Unemployment soared, the currency was unstable, and the very foundations of modern statehood, legal systems, financial institutions, and administrative structures had to be built from scratch while maintaining social cohesion and political stability. The first democratic elections in 1992 produced a surprising result that demonstrated Lithuanian political maturity. The former Communist Party, renamed the Lithuanian Democratic Labour Party, won 73 of 141 parliamentary seats. Rather than attempting to restore Soviet-style policies, the new government committed itself to market reforms and Western integration, recognizing that Lithuania's future lay with Europe rather than with the collapsing Soviet system. This peaceful transition of power and pragmatic policy continuity set an important precedent for Lithuanian democracy. Economic transformation required painful but necessary reforms throughout the 1990s. State enterprises were privatized, the litra's currency was stabilized through a currency board arrangement, and foreign investment was actively courted. The transition was difficult. Gross domestic product fell by over 30% between 1990 and 1994, but the foundations were being laid for sustainable growth. By the late 1990s, Lithuania had dramatically increased trade with Western Europe and reduced inflation from over 1,000% in 1991 to less than 10%. The overriding strategic goal throughout this period was integration with Western institutions, particularly NATO and the European Union. Lithuanian leaders understood that their country's long-term security and prosperity depended on anchoring Lithuania firmly within the Euro-Atlantic community. This wasn't merely a matter of economic calculation but of historical experience. Lithuania had thrived when connected to broader European civilization and suffered when isolated or dominated by imperial powers. The path to NATO membership required extensive military reforms and diplomatic efforts to overcome initial Western reluctance. Many NATO members initially viewed the Baltic states as strategically indefensible and worried that extending security guarantees to former Soviet territories would unnecessarily provoke Russia. Lithuania's response was to demonstrate that it could contribute to collective security rather than merely consume it. Military reforms aligned Lithuanian forces with NATO standards, and Lithuanian participation in international peacekeeping missions showed commitment to shared Western values. The breakthrough came with changing geopolitical circumstances after September 11, 2001, which demonstrated that security threats could emerge from unexpected directions and that expanded cooperation was essential. Lithuania's unwavering support for the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan helped convince skeptics that Baltic states would be reliable allies rather than strategic liabilities. On March 29, 2004, Lithuania formally joined NATO, receiving the security guarantees that had been the primary goal of Lithuanian foreign policy since independence. European Union membership followed just 2 months later, on May 1, 2004, marking Lithuania's full integration into the European community from which it had been forcibly separated in 1940. EU membership brought not only economic opportunities but also institutional frameworks that strengthened Lithuanian democracy and rule of law. EU funds supported infrastructure development, educational programs, and rural development projects that helped modernize the Lithuanian economy and society. The period from 2004 to 2008 became known as Lithuania's Baltic Tiger Years, with economic growth rates often exceeding 8% annually. Foreign investment flowed into manufacturing, services, and real estate, while EU membership provided access to larger markets for Lithuanian goods and services. Urban development transformed Vilnius and other cities, while improved transportation links connected Lithuania more closely with Western Europe. However, rapid growth also created vulnerabilities that became apparent during the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Lithuania experienced one of the deepest recessions in Europe, with gross domestic product falling by nearly 15% in 2009. Unemployment doubled, emigration accelerated, and the government was forced to implement severe austerity measures to maintain fiscal stability. The crisis demonstrated both the benefits and risks of deep integration with global markets. Recovery came faster than many expected, driven by export growth, productivity improvements, and gradual restoration of consumer confidence. Lithuania's adoption of the euro on January 1, 2015, represented both an economic milestone and a symbolic completion of European integration. As the 19th member of the Eurozone, Lithuania gained access to European Central Bank support and eliminated currency risk in trade with its major partners. Initial concerns about price increases proved largely unfounded, and public support for the euro has grown steadily. Modern Lithuania presents a compelling demographic and cultural portrait that reflects both historical influences and contemporary trends. The country's population of approximately 2.8 million is notably homogeneous, with ethnic Lithuanians comprising 84.6% of the total. Polish and Russian minorities, concentrated respectively in southeastern Lithuania and major cities, constitute 6.5% and 5% of the population. This ethnic composition reflects historical settlement patterns, while demonstrating successful integration of minority communities within Lithuanian society. The Lithuanian language, one of the oldest Indo-European languages still spoken, remains remarkably vibrant despite centuries of foreign pressure. Modern Lithuanian incorporates international vocabulary while preserving its distinctive grammatical structure and archaic features that fascinate linguists worldwide. Education in minority languages is available in public schools, reflecting Lithuania's commitment to cultural diversity within a cohesive national framework. Contemporary Lithuanian culture balances deep respect for traditional forms with enthusiastic embrace of modern innovations. Folk music and dance remain popular, while Lithuanian jazz, rock, and electronic music have gained international recognition. The annual song festival continues the tradition established during the independence movement, bringing together thousands of participants to celebrate Lithuanian musical heritage. Visual arts, literature, and cinema have flourished with increased international exposure and European funding support. Lithuania's education system has undergone comprehensive modernization since independence, with literacy rates approaching 100% and over 60% of secondary school graduates continuing to higher education. Vilnius University, founded in 1579, remains the country's premier institution, while technical universities and business schools have adapted to meet the demands of a modern economy. English has become the most popular foreign language, reflecting Lithuania's integration with global markets and international institutions. The contemporary economy has evolved far beyond its Soviet-era focus on heavy industry and agriculture. Services now account for approximately two-thirds of economic output, while manufacturing emphasizes high-value products including biotechnology, information technology, and precision engineering. Lithuania has positioned itself as a regional fintech hub, attracting international financial services companies seeking European Union licensing. The successful development of a liquefied natural gas terminal at Klaipėda has reduced energy dependence on Russia from 100% to approximately 30%. Geographic characteristics continue to shape modern Lithuanian life, though in different ways than in previous centuries. The country's 33% forest coverage supports a thriving timber industry, while providing recreational opportunities for an increasingly urban population. Over 3,000 lakes and 758 rivers support both tourism and fishing industries, while the 99-kilometre Baltic coastline attracts millions of visitors annually to resorts like Palanga and the Curonian Spit, a UNESCO World Heritage Site shared with Russia's Kaliningrad region. Urbanization has accelerated dramatically since independence, with nearly 70% of Lithuanians now living in cities and towns. Vilnius, the capital and largest city, houses approximately 500,000 residents and serves as the country's political, cultural, and economic centre. Kaunas, the interwar capital, remains an important industrial and educational hub, while Klaipėda provides crucial access to Baltic shipping routes. This urban concentration has created new social dynamics while preserving rural traditions in Lithuania's extensive countryside. Modern Lithuania faces demographic challenges common throughout Eastern Europe, particularly population aging and emigration. The total fertility rate of approximately 1.4 children per woman falls well below replacement level, while EU membership has facilitated migration to Western Europe seeking higher wages and broader opportunities. Government initiatives promoting family formation and encouraging return migration have shown some success, but demographic trends remain a long-term policy concern. Lithuania's international role has expanded dramatically since joining NATO and the European Union. The country has contributed troops to international peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Mali, and other regions, demonstrating commitment to collective security. Lithuania hosted the NATO summit in 2023, highlighting its evolution from security consumer to security provider. Support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion in 2022 has been particularly strong, reflecting both solidarity with fellow post-Soviet states and commitment to international law. The COVID-19 pandemic tested Lithuanian resilience and institutional capacity, with the government implementing effective public health measures while maintaining democratic governance and economic support for affected sectors. Digital infrastructure developed for EU integration proved valuable for remote work and education, while Lithuania's pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors contributed to European pandemic response efforts. Environmental consciousness has grown significantly in modern Lithuania, influenced by EU standards and increasing awareness of climate change. Renewable energy development, particularly wind and solar power, aims to reduce dependence on fossil fuel imports while creating new economic opportunities. National parks and nature reserves protect Lithuania's biodiversity, while sustainable tourism promotes economic development consistent with environmental preservation. Contemporary Lithuanian society demonstrates remarkable adaptability while maintaining cultural distinctiveness. Traditional celebrations like Midsummer's Eve and harvest festivals continue alongside international cultural events. Basketball remains the unofficial national sport, with Lithuanian players achieving success in international competitions. The arts scene blends traditional crafts with contemporary design, creating a distinctive Lithuanian aesthetic that appeals to both domestic and international audiences. Looking toward the future, Lithuania faces both opportunities and challenges characteristic of modern European democracies. Technological innovation offers possibilities for economic growth and social development, while demographic trends require creative policy responses. Climate change presents environmental challenges but also opportunities for leadership in sustainable development. Lithuania's experience transitioning from authoritarian rule to democratic governance provides valuable lessons for other societies undergoing similar transformations. As we conclude our journey through Lithuanian history and geography, we find a nation that has successfully navigated the transition from Soviet satellite to European democracy while preserving its cultural identity and historical memory. The amber forests that witnessed medieval battles, foreign occupations, resistance movements, and declarations of independence now shelter a modern society that has achieved the prosperity and security that previous generations could only dream of achieving. Lithuania's story demonstrates that small nations can indeed control their own destiny through persistent effort, strategic thinking, and commitment to shared values. From the pagan tribes who first settled along the Baltic shore to the modern citizens who participate in European institutions while celebrating their unique heritage, Lithuanians have shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. The country that emerged from the Soviet collapse has become a testament to the power of democracy, market economics, and international cooperation. Rest peacefully, fellow travellers, as our exploration of Lithuania comes to an end. In the morning light filtering through those ancient amber forests, we can see a nation that has finally achieved the stability and prosperity that eluded it for so many centuries. The small country by the Baltic Sea has found its place in the modern world, while never forgetting the long journey that brought it to this moment of quiet triumph.